Story 1. He knew when I took out the trash. This happened to me in 2017 when I was living alone in a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet residential loop just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. I was 29 at the time and working remote tech support. Most days were uneventful: emails, instant ramen, neighborhood walks, the kind of life you stop noticing after a while. My trash pickup was every Tuesday. It was just a detail in the week's rhythm, like brushing my teeth. I'd roll the bin down to the curb Monday night after dinner, every Monday, always at the same time, around 9:30 after I cleaned the kitchen. It was automatic. That routine had comfort to it, familiarity, until the night I stepped outside and found the bin wasn't where I'd left it. It wasn't far, just maybe 6 feet from the curb, facing a different angle. But it felt wrong. I stood there for a while, squinting at it. At first I thought maybe the wind had nudged it or a car had clipped it pulling out of the driveway, but the street was quiet. No wind. My neighbor's bins were perfectly upright. Mine was the only one that looked disturbed. That was the first time I noticed how dark my driveway felt at night. I rolled the bin back into place, walked inside, and locked the door. I didn't think much more of it at the time. But the next Monday, it happened again. This time, the bin wasn't just repositioned. It was empty. I stood there in my socks, holding a tied-up trash bag in one hand, staring at the bin. Trash pickup wasn't until Tuesday morning, and I knew I hadn't brought it out early. That meant someone had opened it, someone had gone through it. I checked the lid. There was a small dent along the rim, like it had been forced open and snapped back. It wasn't huge, but it hadn't been there before. It made my skin crawl. I went back inside and didn't sleep well that night. I kept getting up to check the locks. I moved my pepper spray from my car to my nightstand. I left the porch light on until morning. Over the next few weeks, the feeling didn't go away. Every Monday night, I felt watched. I'd start rushing the moment I stepped outside. No earbuds, no distractions, just walking fast, scanning the shadows. I never saw anything. But I started to feel it. The worst part was how subtle it all was. Nothing dramatic, no broken windows, no notes, just tiny signs. The lid not fully closed, the bin nudged a few inches offline, a scratch on the plastic that hadn't been there before. I started putting my trash out in the morning instead, right before the truck came. I figured that would solve it. But the very first Tuesday I did that, I got a text from an unknown number. "You forgot something." That was it. No name, no context. I stared at the screen for maybe a minute before deleting it. I wanted to believe it was spam, that it wasn't what it looked like. But I also didn't take the trash out for the next 2 weeks. I kept it in my garage. The third week, I forced myself to resume. I couldn't live in fear of a garbage can. I told myself that. I wheeled the bin out. But before I did, I checked it, every surface. There were small markings inside, smears along the interior, like someone had dragged their fingers through the coffee grounds and eggshells. That was the last time I used that bin. I bought a locking trash enclosure the next day. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my sister, not my boss. It just felt too strange, too small to report. But I started to feel less safe in my own house. I changed the locks. I left lights on in every room. And I started noticing new things, sounds I couldn't place, quiet knocks at odd hours, the porch motion light flickering for no reason. They were always small things, easy to doubt, but the routine was broken, and fear had taken its place. The detail she almost ignored, the scent of smoke at 3 a.m. It was mid-April when I smelled the cigarette smoke for the first time. I'd gotten up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. My house is one of those small ranch-style places where everything's on one floor. The bathroom is at the far end near the guest room, and the window opens slightly onto the backyard. I hadn't cracked it open in months. But that night I smelled something. Faint, stale smoke. Not like fire. Not like something burning. Just the sharp scent of a cigarette that had been smoked nearby. I don't smoke. My neighbors didn't either, as far as I knew. And the backyard is fully fenced, with no alley behind it. Just woods. I stood by the window, inhaling slowly, trying to convince myself it was coming from somewhere farther off, but it wasn't. It was close. Too close. I closed the window, locked it, stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. Not even birds. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the fence. It's an old wooden thing, not particularly high, but I didn't see any breaks, no footprints in the soil. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been out there. The smell came back a few days later, always around 3 a.m., never strong, never long, just enough to wake me up, just enough to feel invasive. It wasn't until the fourth time that I realized something else. The smell was always strongest when the bathroom light was off. When I'd get up and switch it on, the scent would already be fading, as if whoever was there didn't want to be seen. I started leaving the bathroom light on at night, and for a while the smell stopped. But then something new started. Every few days I'd wake to the sound of gravel shifting, just a few feet away from the bedroom window. My backyard had a narrow path of gravel leading from the deck to the side gate. It made a distinct crunching sound when walked on. I never saw anyone. I started setting my phone on silent camera mode, hoping to catch something, but the motion lights never triggered. Then, one night, I noticed something wedged under the edge of the back fence. A flattened strip of cardboard. It was dry, even after 2 days of rain. That meant it hadn't been there long. It looked like something that had been used to kneel on or hide something under. That was the night I stopped sleeping in my own bedroom. I moved into the living room, slept on the couch with the curtains drawn and the lights on. Still, every night at 3 a.m. I'd wake up, sometimes from the smell, sometimes from nothing. But I always woke up, always feeling like someone had been there and left just seconds before I opened my eyes. I started noticing him 2 months after the trash incidents began. It was subtle at first. A man walking his dog past the house, sitting on the park bench at the corner of the loop. He never looked directly at me, but he was there, always at the edge of things. That's the part that disturbed me most. He didn't hide, but he never approached, never spoke. He just lingered. Eventually, I stopped noticing him altogether, until I caught him on my doorbell camera. It was the playback that got me. The camera had recorded movement at 2:46 a.m. The man stood at the bottom of my driveway, still, not moving. He didn't come up to the door, didn't ring the bell. He just stood there for a full minute and then walked away. The timestamp confirmed it. 2:46 a.m., right before the smoke usually came. I showed it to the police. They told me unless he trespassed, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested motion lights. I already had those. I asked if I could file a report. They said sure, but unless I had more footage, it was unlikely to go anywhere. So I kept watching. 2 nights later, the camera caught him again. This time, he stood a little closer. His hoodie was up, and he kept his hands in his pockets. He didn't look at the house, just stared across the street. The familiarity crept in slowly. He began to blend in with the neighborhood, another face in the background. I saw him once at the gas station, standing by the vending machines, another time walking behind me at the grocery store. Never close enough to call out, never doing anything wrong, just always there. Eventually, I stopped checking the camera every night. I was exhausted, but the fear never fully left. One morning, I opened the app out of habit and found a clip I hadn't seen from 2 days prior. The man stood at the corner of my front steps. He reached into his pocket, took out something small, bent down, and when he stood up and walked away, there was nothing in his hand. I ran outside. On the step under the flower pot was a key. It wasn't mine. It didn't fit any lock on the house. I took it inside, locked every window, slept with a light on. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. and I think I smell smoke. Story 2. The man in the same subway car. This happened to me in late 2018. During the last few months I lived in New York. I was commuting daily on the D line from 36th Street to Columbus Circle, Monday through Friday. I worked as an office assistant at a financial firm near the southwest end of Central Park. Boring stuff mostly, filing, making coffee, answering phones. The routine was simple. Wake up at 6:30, walk 4 blocks to the station, plug in my headphones, and ride the same train for 12 stops. I never listened to anything in particular. Sometimes podcasts, sometimes just white noise. The headphones weren't about audio. They were a shield, a signal that I didn't want to be talked to. If you live in the city long enough, you start curating layers of armor like that. Headphones, sunglasses, blank stares. But one night, after a late client call kept me at the office past 10, my phone died on the walk to the station. I remember checking the screen before descending the steps, 1%. And then nothing. Black screen. It was a weekday. The platform was quiet. Not empty, but sparse. 3 people at most. A man in a denim jacket was pacing near the far bench. Another woman leaned against a column, eyes on her phone. I kept my headphones on anyway, even though they weren't playing anything. It still gave the illusion of control. The train came. I boarded the second car from the front, found a seat near the middle, and sat down. At first it was just quiet. The train rocked gently, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and then I heard it. Breathing. Not just the normal kind you tune out in public. This was different, deliberate, even, too even. It stood out in the quiet like a ticking clock in an empty room. I glanced across the aisle. A young guy in a sweatshirt dozing off. But behind me, a few rows back, I felt something. Not movement, not eyes, just presence. That kind of primal recognition you get when someone's watching you. I shifted slightly, trying to use the reflection in the dark window across from me. I could see a silhouette, male, still, sitting straight up. He didn't move the entire ride, just sat there. That in itself isn't abnormal. People sleep, people zone out. But when we pulled into 59th Street, I got up, and so did he. We weren't at my stop yet. This wasn't even one I usually used, but something in me said move. I stepped off the train and walked to the far side of the platform like I was switching lines. He followed. Same pace, same angle, no hesitation, not a glance at the signs, not a check of his phone, just step for step. I turned suddenly, pretending I'd made a mistake. Walked right past him to the stairs. I expected him to turn around too, but he didn't. He kept walking, not fast, not slow, just forward like a default animation. I got home that night and convinced myself I'd imagined it, that I was just on edge from the long shift. But the next day he was in the same car again. This time I noticed him as I got on. Same coat, same posture, no bag, and he was staring straight ahead. Not at me. Not at anyone, just through the space, like his eyes weren't fixed on the train, but on the idea of someone. I tried not to react. Sat farther down, but I didn't put my headphones in because I wanted to hear, and there it was again, that breathing, even, rhythmic, mechanical. Every stop I listened to see if he'd move. He never did, until mine. And then he stood up again, same slow pace, same trajectory. That was the night I realized the headphones hadn't been protecting me. They'd been silencing the one thing that warned me he was real. I started modifying my route after that. Small things at first, boarding a different car, entering from the opposite platform, even riding one stop farther and backtracking. But he adjusted. The first time I took the B line instead, he was already there. Different clothes. This time a dark knit cap, tan jacket, still alone, still silent. I remember watching him through the train's reflection, one hand loosely gripping the rail, not swaying with the car. His balance was unnatural. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't him. until he turned slightly and I caught the same subtle movement, his eyes scanning the window, not for himself, but for me. That's when I stopped sitting. I'd ride the whole route standing, near the doors, always angled to exit fast. I noticed he never sat near anyone else, never touched the poles, never took out a phone. Eventually, I tried switching departure times, leaving 15 minutes earlier than usual, then 30, but it never worked for long. Within days, he'd be back in the car with me. There was no pattern. I couldn't explain it to anyone. When I did try to mention it, to a co-worker, to my sister, the conversation always looped back to me. Are you sure it's the same guy? Maybe he works near you. Sounds like a coincidence. But it wasn't. It was too perfect. He didn't follow, he didn't chase, he simply showed up, always in orbit. And that made it worse. Because predators don't always pounce. Sometimes they circle. I stopped taking the subway altogether for a week and took the bus. It took twice as long. I remember one afternoon stepping off at my transfer stop and seeing him across the intersection, standing under a payphone, watching traffic. He didn't approach. He never approached. I started feeling like I was imagining it all. But one morning I left the house extra early, trying to beat the pattern. The sun hadn't fully risen. I walked the 6 blocks to a different station, not mine, one I hadn't used in years. And when the train pulled up, I stepped inside, and he was there, already seated, as if he knew, as if he'd known all along. That was the first time he looked directly at me, only for a second. But it felt like the cold recognition of someone who'd been rehearsing the moment in his mind for months. He never spoke, not once. But I started recognizing things about him. He never wore logos. His coat was always zipped halfway. He walked with his hands open, never in his pockets. These weren't things I meant to learn, but repetition builds intimacy, even when it's one-sided. By the 3rd month, I could spot him instantly in a crowd. His stillness had a signature, and I began to notice the inverse effect, my life shrinking to accommodate his presence. I stopped going to the gym, stopped visiting the coffee shop by my office, stopped using the main entrance to my building. Everywhere I went, I scanned for him. And sometimes I saw him, even when he wasn't there. The worst part was how familiar he became, not just as a threat, but as a presence. The same way you recognize the shape of your own shadow. One night I stayed late at work again. My co-workers had gone. The building was mostly empty. Around 9:45, I decided to call a rideshare instead of braving the subway. I took the back elevator down, and when the doors opened, he was there, standing in the lobby, not inside, just across the glass on the sidewalk, staring through the doors as if he'd been waiting. I didn't exit. I pressed 2 and the elevator doors closed again. My hands were shaking. Back at the office, I locked myself inside and sat under the desk. I didn't leave until after midnight, and when I did, the street was empty. But I never stopped wondering if he'd ever really left. The next morning, there was a folded piece of paper under my apartment door. No note, just a single word, typed in the center, routine. I moved 2 weeks later, deleted every app, changed jobs. I never filed a police report because nothing ever happened. But I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. To this day, if I hear breathing that's too even, I take the next train. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. Story 3. He rented the apartment across from mine. This happened to me in 2016, right after I moved into my first solo apartment in Chicago. It was a modest 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a U-shaped brick building in Logan Square, the kind with 2 facing wings and a narrow courtyard in between. My windows faced directly into the opposite wing, and if I looked out from my couch or bed, I could see straight into the living rooms of 5 or 6 other tenants. It felt normal at first. Everyone had curtains. Everyone kept to themselves. until apartment 3B became occupied. That unit was exactly across from mine. Same layout, same view, just mirrored. For the first few weeks, it was empty. Then, one Saturday morning, I noticed moving boxes through the blinds. Later that day, I saw him, a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Tall, pale, unshaven. He wore a grey hoodie with the sleeves pushed up and moved slowly, methodically, like someone unpacking pieces of a museum exhibit. At first, I paid him no mind. We were just neighbours. But I started to notice something strange about the lighting. Most people keep their blinds shut, especially in the evenings. But not him. His windows were always open, no curtains, just light. Every night around 8, his television screen would flicker in the dark, glowing blue and white. And when I passed through my living room, I'd feel his apartment go still. Not dark, just paused. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but after a few days, I began testing the pattern. I'd walk past my window, deliberately slow. And sure enough, the flicker of his screen would dim. Not off, just muted, as if someone had changed tabs. When I stopped walking, the light returned to full brightness. One night, I stepped into my living room wearing a hoodie I only wore around the house. Nothing special. As I passed by the window, I noticed a movement across the courtyard. He was standing by his own window now, not seated like usual, just standing, looking toward mine. The light behind him was faint, but enough to catch the shape of his head, tilting slightly. Not waving, not moving, just acknowledging. That was the first night I shut my curtains before bed. The first thing to go missing was a scarf. It was nothing special, just a black wool scarf I kept hung on a wall hook near the door. I wore it almost every day. Then one morning in late October, it was gone. I searched everywhere, every drawer, every hook, under the couch cushions. It wasn't there. I assumed I'd dropped it outside somewhere. 3 days later, I came home from work and found it folded neatly on the small patio chair outside my window. No note, no tag, just the scarf, as if I had left it there to dry. But I hadn't. There was no way it could have blown up there. I was on the 3rd floor. I asked the upstairs neighbor, whose balcony extended just slightly above mine, if she'd seen anything. She hadn't. I told myself maybe I'd brought it out and forgot. But the next week I ordered a small package, a necklace for my sister's birthday. It was marked delivered by the postal service but never showed up. A week later I got a knock on the door. It was the man from 3B. Up close, he looked slightly older than I'd thought. His eyes didn't quite match his smile. He held out a padded envelope. "This was in my box by mistake," he said. I took it. There was no name written on it, just my address and an Amazon barcode. I thanked him and shut the door quickly. Inside, the packaging was slightly torn, and the little jewelry box inside was unsealed. The necklace was there, but the clasp was broken. I ordered another one. After that, small objects began shifting locations. Keys on the counter were left turned in a different direction. A glass I hadn't used appeared on the windowsill. My dish sponge was wet in the morning when I hadn't washed anything the night before. None of it was big. None of it could be proven, but something was off. Someone was inside, or near enough to touch what was mine. By mid-November, I couldn't sleep. My heart raced at small sounds. The clink of the radiator, a creak in the floorboards. I started leaving a white noise machine on at night, but I kept waking up every morning between 3 and 4 a.m. Not from a noise, just from something internal. A sense of being watched. My therapist later said it was cortisol dysregulation, a body locked in a loop of alertness. I began placing objects in specific positions before I left for work. Shoes arranged heel to toe, hair ties placed in an exact row, so I could see if anything had moved. I bought a small USB camera, cheap, motion-activated. I hid it behind a potted plant facing the main room. That night, nothing happened. The next morning, I checked the footage. At 2:13 a.m., the lights flickered once. And then, for less than 2 seconds, the camera recorded a movement. just a shadow. Something passed through the narrow slice of frame. I couldn't make it out, but I saw something. And then the footage cut. Corrupted file. I bought a better camera the next day, one with cloud backup. I also called the property manager and asked if anyone had reported suspicious activity. They said no, but they confirmed something I hadn't expected. The previous tenant in 3B had broken lease suddenly, citing privacy issues. That night, I kept the lights off, sat by the window, curtains slightly open, watching. For hours, nothing. Then, around 2:40 a.m., his living room light flicked on. He walked to the window and sat down, facing mine. No TV, no book, just sitting, staring. We were two silhouettes, 20 feet apart, separated by cold glass and silence. He stayed there until dawn. And when the sky began to pale, he stood, walked back into the darkness of his unit, and turned the light off. I moved out at the end of the month. I didn't leave a forwarding address, didn't tell anyone exactly why, but I still think about that last morning, how he sat there, as if waiting for the next version of me to move in. Another mirror to look into, another life to reflect, and maybe reshape.